I was watching a recent Starship test flight with an old colleague of mine, a brilliant academic type, the kind of guy who has spent his entire career writing papers on orbital dynamics. As the engines lit and that massive stainless steel cylinder began to heave itself off the pad, tearing up concrete and kicking up a chaotic storm of dust, I expected him to be thrilled. Instead, he was wincing. He pointed at the screen, almost offended by the violence of it all. "It's so messy," he complained. "Look at the tiles popping off. It's crude, it's reckless. Where is the precision? Where is the elegance?" He started comparing it to the Saturn V, talking about the Apollo era as if it were a religious experience, a delicate dance of perfect engineering that we had somehow lost the ability to replicate. To him, the explosion of noise and the risk of failure were signs of regression, proof that we were doing it wrong. That reaction, that specific obsession with elegance, is exactly why we have been stuck in low Earth orbit for 50 years. He was judging a freight train by the standards of a Fabergé. He viewed space as a cathedral, a quiet, sacred place for a few chosen astronauts to visit on a pilgrimage. But looking at that ugly, lumbering metal tower, I realized he was missing the most important shift in human history. He saw a sloppy rocket. I saw the first ugly, beautiful days of a deep space shipyard. And if we want a future that actually exists, we have to stop building monuments and start breaking things. That opening really, it sets the stage perfectly for our deep dive today. We're going to explore this exact philosophical war, the idea of space as a pristine, elegant cathedral versus, well, a shipyard.
A shipyard, an industrial zone built on noise, on logistics, and a little bit of chaos.
Exactly. And our mission here is to show you how this massive radical transformation in the economics of space travel is forcing a huge global restructuring. And critically, why the real roadblocks aren't technological at all.
Not at all. They're bureaucratic. We've pulled together a whole stack of material here. Everything from launch economics, asteroid geology, international space law, all the way to, believe it or not, medical regulatory analysis.
And there's a common thread, right?
A core thread. And it's this deep institutional resistance to radical, messy growth. So we're going to dissect how these new launch economics could actually enable us to relocate industry off-world.
We'll look at why resource scarcity on Earth could become basically obsolete.
And then, and this is the really crucial part, we'll examine how these rigid legal and medical bureaucracies are actively getting in the way, how they're impeding humanity's, necessary expansion and flourishing.
Okay, let's start at the very foundation of all of this. The new calculus of space. This whole philosophical shift, it really hinges on just one number, which some are calling the single God metric.
It is. It's the cost per kilogram to low Earth orbit. For decades, that number was an iron law. It defined our limits. It wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It was, for all intents and purposes, a physical barrier.
And when you look back at that baseline of scarcity, I mean, the costs were they were completely prohibitive.
Oh, absolutely.
We tend to look at the space shuttle era with these rose-tinted glasses, a symbol of national ambition. But the cost was around $18,500 per kilogram. Just to Leo.
$18,500. And for other government systems, it was even worse. You could easily be looking at over $50,000 per kilogram.
Let's just pause on what that price really means. If you wanted to put, I don't know, a standard refrigerator into orbit.
You're looking at $500,000.
Yeah.
Just for the ride.
So at that price point, you can't justify sending up industrial grade steel. You can't send mundane construction materials or bulk machinery. It's off the table.
Completely. Space was reserved entirely for these small, highly specialized, bespoke payloads.
Yeah.
Government stunts, incredibly expensive scientific instruments, military satellites. It was mathematically impossible to build anything lasting. A port? A supply chain?
Forget about it. The sheer cost of logistics dictated total scarcity.
That's the before picture. The technological shift happening right now is completely rewriting that calculus.
Right. We've already seen huge progress with reusable rockets like the Falcon 9. That brought the costs down, well, dramatically. Closer to what, $2,600 per kilogram?
Which is an order of magnitude shift, absolutely. But, even at $2,600, engineers still had to treat every single gram like it's precious metal.
It's still not cheap enough for industry.
Exactly. The true disruption, the shift that really enables this whole shipyard philosophy, is the projected cost for the next generation of massive, fully reusable systems. We're talking about projections that are aiming to drop that cost below $100 a kilogram.
Okay, let's really unpack that. When the cost of something plummets from, say, the price of a luxury sports car all the way down to the price of a new flat-screen TV,
The whole logic changes.
what you can send, and more importantly, why you're sending it, it just fundamentally shifts. The vehicle itself is no longer this precious artifact you have to protect at all costs.
Precisely. If mass is no longer your primary constraint, your engineers can stop obsessing over exotic, bespoke materials, these ultra-lightweight carbon fiber structures, and they can start thinking about volume, about frequency.
So that vehicle, it stops being a rocket in that classic, delicate, almost sacred sense.
It becomes what our sources describe as a brutal instrument of logistics. It's the first true deep space container ship.
I love that phrase, brutal instrument of logistics. It's perfect. It captures the whole shipyard idea. You don't ask if a container ship is beautiful or elegant.
You ask if it's reliable. Is it durable? And, most important of all, is it cheap to operate? Its value is purely 100% utilitarian.
And once you make that mental shift, once you embrace that utilitarian view, the entire concept of where you put your industry it flips on its head.
For centuries, industry has been tied to gravity, right? You build near your resources or near your markets. Now, the new constraints are access to zero gravity and access to, well, infinite energy and resources.
Both of which are in space.
Both of which are in space.
Which brings us right to this idea of industrial relocation. Apollo was a huge national triumph, a symbol of pride and capacity, but if you look at it in purely economic terms,
it was an industrial failure. It established no port, no lasting supply chain, zero permanent infrastructure. It was a magnificent exploratory voyage, but it was
a stunt, a dead end.
A dead end. The new economy is the complete reverse of that. Sub $100 per kilogram costs mean you could finally afford to send at the machinery you need. The cranes, the robotics, the habitat modules, the bulk materials. You can start actually constructing orbital foundries and zero-gravity manufacturing plants.
So what are we building up there that's so much better than what we can build down here? What's the killer app for zero-G manufacturing?
Well, the list is growing, but the immediate gains are in processes that are basically ruined by gravity or by air. Think about casting extremely pure semiconductor crystals, for example.
Or fabricating flawless fiber optics.
Exactly. On Earth, gravity introduces tiny imperfections, stress, structural flaws. In orbit, manufacturing perfection becomes the norm, not the exception. The economic logic is, it's inescapable. If you can make a better, cheaper product in zero-G, heavy industry will eventually move there.
And this is where the human element, the social cost, really comes into focus. We have that really powerful anecdote about Frank, right? The third-generation machinist from the U.S. Rust Belt.
Frank's story is so important because it just perfectly captures the emotional trade-off here. He's standing in his workshop, it smells of coolant and oil, and he's looking at these multi-ton, earthbound lathes and presses.
Tools that represent 3 generations of skill, a very specific gravity-constrained skill.
And he has this realization that they're becoming artifacts. They're destined for a museum or for scrap metal.
And at the same time, his daughter, who's a young engineer, she's not looking for a job in Detroit or Pittsburgh, the cities that defined heavy industry for a century.
No. She's moving to a launch site in Brownsville, Texas, to design robotic systems and zero-gravity foundries for orbital manufacturing. It's the physical, emotional embodiment of an entire industrial base leaving the planet.
This industrial transfer, moving all the heavy polluting stuff off-world, it's often framed as outsourcing pollution, isn't it?
It is, and that's a fair question to ask. Are we just turning space into a bigger, messier industrial dumping ground?
It's the key question. On one hand, yeah, you're putting industrial hazards out of sight, out of mind. But on the other, if the heavy, messy, high-energy demand industries are moved entirely off-world, then you could fundamentally decouple Earth from its most destructive industrial processes. The counter-argument is that this transfer is actually the ultimate form of planetary-level environmental stewardship.
So it's not avoiding the problem, it's a practical solution.
Yeah, exactly. The idea is we can preserve Earth as a residential zone, a park, a cultural hub, whatever, powered by clean energy. While the industrial heartland, all the messy, energy-intensive, resource-heavy work, is conducted entirely in orbit using extraterrestrial resources, you fundamentally remove the conflict between industrial growth and planetary preservation.
That leads us right into the philosophical resistance then. The urgency of what some call accelerationism versus safetyism. Because this kind of mass-scale disruption, it inevitably runs headfirst into our modern risk aversion. It does. And this new space philosophy, it fundamentally sees bureaucracy, delay, and risk aversion as the primary enemies. The whole expansion is framed as a kind of necessary war against entropy, a moral imperative even to accelerate past these human-imposed bottlenecks.
The critique of modern safety culture is, well, it's pretty scathing. They argue that regulatory delay isn't protection, it's self-sabotage.
Yeah, the example they use is obsessing over minor environmental studies for a new launch pad,
Yeah.
Concerning a local bird population, while completely ignoring the massive existential threat facing the species as a whole.
That kind of meticulous caution gets characterized as planetary-level self-sabotage, a crime against the future.
The point being made is, the fear of fire would have kept our ancestors huddled in their caves forever. Progress is inherently risky. It's inherently messy.
And this feeds directly into the ultimate accelerationist argument, which is the great filter. The idea being that if you focus entirely on these meticulous, cautious, earthbound safety protocols, you are completely ignoring the 100% long-term probability of a catastrophic, civilization-ending event.
Correct. The threats are global, and they are inevitable. A supervolcano, a planet-killing asteroid, or something we cause ourselves, like a global war or an engineered pandemic.
And if the entire continued existence of our species is trapped in what they call a single fragile basket, Earth, then our current safety protocols aren't safety at all.
They're a guarantee of eventual extinction.
So under this kind of radical risk calculus, reckless expansion into the solar system, even if it means a few messy explosion-filled launch tests,
It becomes the ultimate long-term safety measure for the species. You're diversifying the biological portfolio. You're creating a backup.
the urgency is paramount then. Every day we delay setting up off-world supply chains or habitats. It just increases the probability that the great filter catches us before we become truly multiplanetary.
It forces you to redefine what safe means. Safe isn't zero risk tomorrow. Safe is survival guaranteed 1,000 years from now.
Okay, that completely shifts the framework. So if part one was about making the journey cheap and necessary, part two has to be about what we actually gain when we get there. It's about dismantling global scarcity and the commodity cartels built on top of it.
And this move into space resources, it's not just about building cool things in orbit. It's a geopolitical and economic imperative to escape our terrestrial dependence. Just look at resource vulnerability right now.
The scale of that dependency is frankly shocking. The U.S. relies on imports for over 50% of the minerals it consumes, and that includes the most critical materials for modern tech.
We're talking about key minerals like lithium and cobalt, which are essential for batteries. We're talking about rare earth elements, which you need for everything from smart weapons to the magnets and wind turbines.
And this dependency is only getting worse, isn't it? The global push for a clean energy transition, all this investment in EVs and renewables, is projected to quadruple the demand for these exact same materials.
Yes, and that concentrated demand translates directly into geopolitical leverage, or, as you said, choke points.
Right. Consider the processing of rare earth elements. 80% of global processing happens in China.
Or cobalt. 41% of the world's supply comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. When your supply is that concentrated, the nations who control the source can exert immense economic and strategic pressure.
And we've seen them do it. We've seen that pressure weaponized. China restricted the export of gallium and germanium vital for semiconductors just back in 2023. It was a clear signal.
A very clear signal that terrestrial resources are entirely subject to the political whims of your rivals. The only real solution is to decouple your supply chains.
And beyond the geopolitics, there's a serious ethical dimension here too.
You can't ignore it. Terrestrial extraction often involves massive environmental damage, excessive water use, toxic waste, and in certain regions, just horrible human rights abuses and dangerous working conditions. Asteroid mining, which would be done by robots in a vacuum, avoids all of those entrenched ethical problems.
So let's look up at the prize. What is the actual value proposition of an asteroid belt economy? The numbers you hear thrown around sound like science fiction.
The scale is almost incomprehensible from our terrestrial perspective. The estimates suggest the asteroid belt contains resources with a total value of around $100 billion for every single person on Earth.
100 billion per person. That number sounds fake. Can you break down why the value is so astronomical?
Sure. It's because of how Earth formed. During its formation, most of the heavy, dense, valuable metals, things like iron, nickel, and especially the platinum group metals or PGMs.
Platinum, palladium, rhodium.
Right. All of that stuff sank into our planet's core. So the concentration near the surface is actually relatively low, which is what creates scarcity and high prices. Asteroids, especially the M-type or metallic ones, are essentially the exposed cores of protoplanets that never fully formed.
So there's floating chunks of the stuff we can't easily get to down here.
Exactly. A single one of these metallic asteroids can contain reserves of iron, nickel, and cobalt that exceed Earth's entire known recoverable supply. And the PGMs are the real key.
They're crucial for catalysts, high-tech electronics, and they currently trade for tens of thousands of dollars per kilogram.
And you can find an asteroid that is millions of tons of this stuff just floating there. That's not an incremental gain. That is a complete economic paradigm shift.
This brings us back to that boardroom panic anecdote. So you're the CEO of a rare earth mining conglomerate. Your entire business model is built on controlled, finite scarcity.
You're sitting in your high-rise office, looking down at your terrestrial mine, which represents billions in sunk costs. And your analyst projects this image, a hologram of a robotic lander securing itself to a high-value M-type asteroid. The panic you feel isn't about local competition.
It's about total market annihilation.
Exactly. The analysis is that a single successful return mission, bringing back millions of tons of platinum group metals, would instantly crash the global commodity price of those materials to near zero.
All that scarcity, which is the entire basis of geopolitical and cartel power, just evaporates overnight.
That is the core economic disruption. It replaces the mindset of limitation with one of abundance. This is what's called the infinite resource paradigm. You're shifting from a zero-sum game where nations fight over limited resources to an infinite game where you bake a bigger pie by going off-world.
It's framed as the most peaceful, long-term solution to our resource problems.
It is.
But the potential is staggering. And so is the investment required to get this started. I mean, we're talking about developing entirely new technologies, entire new supply chains. How do we fund this new frontier?
That's the challenge. The industry faces a really significant investment cap. Space mining is too costly, too risky, and the timelines are just way too long for typical venture capital or small startups to handle on their own.
And we've seen companies try and fail already, haven't we?
We have. Several private companies that initially jumped into the space have already gone under. This is an extremely capital-intensive industry. It needs significant, patient government momentum to bridge that initial gap.
So what are the concrete actions governments could take to stimulate this market?
Well, the first recommendation is to establish government-sponsored funds that are explicitly dedicated to domestic space mining startups and deep space infrastructure. We have models for this.
Like Japan.
Japan is a great example. They announced a nearly $1 billion fund, $940 million back in 2018, to support their space ecosystem. And the result was rapid advancements in their robotics and lunar power systems. Government capital provides a stability and a long-term vision that private markets often lack.
The second point targets NASA's budget, right? It argues for a fundamental reallocation of priorities.
It does. Given how mature the commercial launch sector is becoming, the argument is that NASA's current budget is, well, it's backward-looking if the goal is industrialization.
Human spaceflight gets the lion's share.
Nearly 50% of the agency's annual budget goes to human spaceflight activities. That's a huge amount dedicated to these bespoke missions and exploration. The recommendation is to drastically reduce that and instead increase investment in robotic missions and resource research, which currently sits at around 30%.
So shift the priority from sending a few astronauts on trips to actually enabling the industrial base.
Precisely. Demonstrate the resource utilization technologies. And the third recommendation is about structuring the incentives through government contracts, mirroring a model that's already proven successful.
The Commercial Lunar Payload Services Model, or CLPS.
Yes. Under CLPS, NASA doesn't design the lander itself. It just contracts with private companies to deliver payloads to the moon. We need to apply that exact same model to resource utilization.
So you'd offer guaranteed contracts for specific deliverables.
Exactly. A contract for bringing back a sample of lunar-derived water ice. Or a contract for demonstrating the successful refining of metallic regolith. You incentivize American companies to develop the tech by giving them a guaranteed customer.
Okay, so if the economics and the geopolitical imperative are so clear and we have viable funding models, why aren't we doing this full steam ahead? What is the biggest single bottleneck that's preventing this shipyard future?
And that brings us directly to part 3. The legal bottleneck. It is a war over outer space property rights. A war rooted in treaties written during the Cold War that simply did not and could not anticipate a future where private companies could extract trillions of dollars of resources.
The foundational document here is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, the OST. What's the core principle it established, and where's the main ambiguity today?
The OST established space as the province of all mankind, under the principle of res communis omnium, a thing belonging to the entire community. The critical constraint is Article 2, which explicitly prohibits national appropriation of celestial bodies.
So you can't plant a flag and claim the moon for your country.
Correct. But the ambiguity, the loophole that investors and private companies are seizing on, is whether that prohibition extends to private entities extracting, owning, and selling the resources after they've been removed.
Can a U.S. company capture an asteroid and declare ownership of the nickel inside it?
That is the trillion-dollar question. And the counter-argument that tried to shut that down was the 1979 Moon Agreement.
Which was a legal failure.
A total failure. It only has 14 signatories, none of whom are major space powers. But it's important because it introduced the concept of the common heritage of mankind, or CHM.
And what does CHM mandate that the original OST does not?
CHM mandates that resources must be exploited under an international regime for the benefit of all humanity, with equitable sharing of any profits.
And the fact that it failed to gain support tells you everything you need to know.
It does. The spacefaring nations, the ones with the actual capability to do the work, saw the CHM principle as way too restrictive, a non-starter. They essentially said, if we have to share the profits with nations that contributed nothing to the effort, we just won't bother going.
This tension has now created two dramatically competing legal philosophies, and they mirror the current geopolitical rivalry between the U.S. and China.
Exactly. The U.S. has staked its claim on a clear free market approach. In 2020, the U.S. explicitly rejected CHM and the whole global commons designation. They view outer space as a unique domain where private enterprise should be encouraged.
And they back that up with law, the 2015 Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act,
which provides the legal foundation for all of this. It explicitly grants U.S. citizens the right to own and use resources once they're extracted, while very carefully stating that the U.S. government is not claiming national sovereignty over the body itself.
A clever distinction, and Luxembourg followed a similar path.
They did, in 2017. It shows that even smaller nations see the economic opportunity in providing legal certainty. And building on that legal foundation, we got the Artemis Accords.
A U.S.-led initiative, now up to 56 signatories. It seeks to establish norms for resource use, including this highly controversial idea of safety zones.
And this is where the controversy really sharpens, because critics argue that these safety zones, which are meant to prevent harmful interference between different operations on the moon, are essentially a backdoor to territorialization, a soft land grab in space that violates the spirit of the OST.
You're claiming a sphere of influence, an area of operational priority.
Absolutely. And while this is happening, you see this fascinating strategic pivot from China in their counter-narrative. The U.S. rejected global commons, but China, which used to reject it, has now embraced it.
So China now positions itself as the champion of universal access.
They use that legal framing to criticize the Artemis Accords, characterizing the safety zones and resource proposals as, and this is a, quote, European colonial enclosure land-taking methods.
This rivalry is creating dueling frameworks.
It is. The choice for other nations is becoming stark. Do you align with the U.S.-led Artemis initiative with its focus on private extraction and free markets? Or do you align with the China-Russia International Lunar Research Station, the ILRS, which promotes a more state-controlled multilateral approach? You're being forced to pick a side in space governance.
So in the absence of a universally accepted framework, what kind of legal regime should we adopt? What would actually support the massive investment required for this industrial shipyard future? We obviously need certainty.
The first step is to reject past terrestrial analogies. They were all developed in an environment of perceived scarcity, not infinite potential. The law of the sea, UNCLS III, is totally inadequate. Its common heritage principle just restricts exploitation and creates too much regulatory uncertainty.
And the Antarctica Treaty is also a poor model.
It's flawed because it was designed purely for scientific investigation. It lacks the authoritative governing body and the financial mechanisms you need for commercial mineral extraction.
So if the past doesn't give us a template, what does a growth-oriented legal regime look like? One that provides certainty without just collapsing under geopolitical rivalry.
The proposal centers on creating a new multinational authority. It would be based on new multilateral agreements designed to harmonize national laws and provide a single point of certainty for investors.
And the design of that authority would be critical.
Absolutely. It would need equal representation from both spacefaring and non-spacefaring nations.
Why is that equal representation so crucial? It seems like it could lead to gridlock.
It's crucial to address the perception of a cartel head-on. Without it, the dominant space powers, the US, China, Russia, would just co-opt the authority to cement their own advantage. It would have no legitimacy. To prevent that gridlock, the design would also have to include a neutral, third-party expert whose only role is to cast a deciding vote in any split decision.
To guarantee impartiality. And what would this authority functionally do?
It would issue clear permits and licenses for resource extraction. These would grant private entities secure property rights for the collection, ownership, and transportation of the resources they gather. The stability of those rights is the bedrock of investment.
And the fees from those permits could be used to create a global benefit.
Exactly. The fees could be directed specifically to engineering education and space tech development in developing countries. It offers a direct, tangible benefit that offsets the lost terrestrial resource revenue those nations might otherwise face.
But if you issue licenses and establish property rights, how do you police it? You have no police force in space.
You need a dedicated system for dispute resolution. A tribunal or an international arbitration mechanism designed specifically for space law. Without that, there's no way to resolve claims of piracy or claims of one entity interfering in another's safety zone or just outright trespassing.
So you're borrowing heavily from maritime law principles, where nations are held accountable for the vessels that fly their flag.
Precisely. Nations must be held accountable for the actions of their nationals and their vessels in space. The multinational authority could impose significant fines, revoke permits, or restrict access for nations that fail to adequately police the activities of their registered space vessels. It creates a regulatory loop.
We've spent a lot of time defining this ideological clash, the clean cathedral versus the messy shipyard in space. But this philosophy of bureaucratic resistance, this pervasive safetyism, it isn't just limited to space, is it?
No, and this is a crucial pivot. The same institutional mindset that creates the bureaucratic barrier to progress in space governance. We see it impeding medical innovation and patient care right here on Earth. It's the sheer human cost of paralysis.
Let's look at the stats on clinical trial participation. They're just dishearteningly low. Nationally, only about 6% of cancer patients in the U.S. participate in clinical trials.
And a major reason for that isn't a lack of interest from patients. It's systemic failures in guidance and logistics. We have this visceral account detailing the immense personal effort required just to navigate this system.
A patient who had failed all standard treatments, and they described this obsessive perseverance they needed just to get access to a potentially life-prolonging clinical trial for a drug called petosemtamab. It wasn't offered to them. They had to fight for it.
And they were actively discouraged from doing so. Multiple oncologists, the supposed experts, suggested they just stick to the standard palliative chemo then die path. It reinforces the status quo. To find that trial, the patient had to expend this massive amount of mental and physical energy that a typical thick person simply cannot muster.
This really highlights the tragedy of what some call the FDA paradox. The FDA's core mission is vital, right? Preventing unsafe drugs from injuring patients. But when you apply that mission to terminal patients who have exhausted every standard therapy,
it transforms into a Kafkaesque absurdity. The agency is, in effect, protecting these terminal patients from a drug that might extend their life or even save them.
The end result is that they safely die of cancer. You're protecting them from the risk of a new drug while ensuring the 100% risk death from their disease is realized.
The argument for reform here is so powerful. If a patient has a fatal diagnosis, they naturally have the right and the capacity to consent to risk. The suggestion is to move terminal drug approval closer to the surgical model. Surgeons can operate with minimal regulatory oversight when treating fatal conditions.
And the logic is that accelerating a drug that might save thousands in the future far outweighs the risk of injury to a patient who has already run out of time.
But the bureaucratic misery doesn't stop at trial enrollment. It acts as a kind of misery multiplier that follows patients through the entire process, just eroding their limited time and energy.
We see these shocking logistical failures just from lack of simple automation and standardization in care, for instance, managing chemotherapy side effects. The initial antiemetic plan provided by the oncologist was just totally inadequate for high-dose chemo.
Basic drugs like Zofran, a single IV dose of Amend. It wasn't enough. The patient's partner, who happened to be an ER doctor, had to basically direct their own care. They had to insist on a robust, multi-day, multi-drug regimen, oral amend, olanzapine, Ativan, just to prevent hours of debilitating vomiting.
And the question is, if this robust regimen is optimal, cheap, and readily available, why isn't it the automated, standardized default for every single patient?
Because the system prioritizes minimizing the logistical hassle for the institution over maximizing the quality of life for the patient. It's that simple. Another powerful example is the administrative burden right after a major surgery.
The patient was recovering from a tracheostomy, a flap replacement. They were entirely unable to speak. And yet, the hospital and insurance systems initiated this barrage of phone calls demanding documentation and administrative compliance.
You're forcing an incapacitated individual to divert precious energy away from healing and toward dealing with paperwork. It's an act of bureaucratic violence against the vulnerable.
This systemic friction is so pervasive, it actually led to the coining of what's called Seliger's Law.
And we should all remember this. A broken system can stay broken for longer than people have the time, energy, and ability to try fixing it. When you are physically weak, financially strained, and psychologically exhausted, the time tax of bureaucracy can be absolutely insurmountable.
And the most poignant example of the system failure, for me anyway, is the PEG tube oversight. The patient used this large, protruding PEG tube for months. It was clumsy, restrictive, and it led to multiple ER visits.
Once, because the tube leaked partially digested food and stomach acid. That protruding tube was standard for the initial 2 months of healing. But after that, a smaller, more humane button tube, a Mickey, was available.
Which lies flush against the stomach. It vastly improves comfort and quality of life. And yet, for months, the medical system failed to proactively inform the patient or schedule the automatic switch.
Only after seeking advice from an outside oncologist was he even told that this better option existed. This system missed the chance to automate a basic quality of life recommendation.
It just highlights how much of our medical care is left to the luck of finding an exceptionally persistent patient or an outside expert, rather than relying on standardized, optimal protocols.
And this brings us full circle, back to that core philosophical stasis mentality. The same institutional bias, this pervasive fear of change, this prioritization of minimizing immediate, small, visible risks. That is the same DNA shared by the FDA, by infrastructure planning, and critically, by international space law.
And that bias is amplified by the media feedback loop, isn't it? Success in accelerating medicine is often quiet and technical, but a single negative side effect, one death from a cutting-edge drug, gets amplified across every platform.
Which leads to systemic overcaution. Everywhere. The focus on minimizing these small risks completely outweighs the value of accelerating progress that could save thousands of lives on Earth, or even save the entire species by establishing a foothold in space. That prioritization of short-term, messy safety over long-term, explosive growth is the single greatest inhibitor of human flourishing.
We have covered an enormous amount of ground today. We've really examined two sides of the same coin. The immense technological possibility of a deep space industrial future, and the profound terrestrial resistance it faces.
And the core conflict, at the end of the day, it isn't technological. It's philosophical. There's a necessary push for radical growth and technological acceleration that is continuously being thwarted by this pervasive system of bureaucratic inertia and what we've been calling safetyism.
And that holds true whether that bureaucracy is in Washington, D.C. shaping space policy, or in international legal frameworks, or even in the oncology protocols of the FDA.
The vision of a true multiplanetary civilization, one that's capable of accessing infinite resources and ensuring the survival of the species, depends entirely on our willingness to stop building these beautiful cathedrals and monuments to our past achievements.
We have to embrace the noise, the risk, and the brutal, messy growth of the shipyard. And we have to start dismantling the legal and bureaucratic structures that keep us confined, arguing over scraps in a single and increasingly fragile basket.